Tomyris sa narodila do civilizačného okruhu, ktorý dnešní historici zaraďujú k iránskym nomádskym národom starovekej Strednej Ázie. Nebola princeznou v klasickom zmysle slova, ako si ju často predstavujeme podľa neskorších malieb. Nevyrastala v mramorových sálach. Nevyrastala za múrmi, ktoré ju chránili pred svetom. Ak bola skutočne dcérou alebo príslušníčkou vládnucej vrstvy Massagetov, potom jej detstvo bolo pravdepodobne poznačené úplne iným druhom. Výchovou, v ktorej sa moc nespájala len s rodokmeňom, ale so schopnosťou prežiť, rozhodovať.
Welcome to Relics of Time. If you love ancient history, forgotten empires, legendary rulers, and stories that still echo across the centuries, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring these ancient worlds back to life. Tonight, we travel far beyond the walls of Babylon, beyond the palaces of Persia, and beyond the marble memory of kings. We ride east, across vast open lands where the horizon seems endless, where the wind never truly stops, and where the earth belongs not to stone cities, but to horsemen. This is the world of the steppe. A world of speed, movement, harsh survival, and fierce freedom. And in that world, long before many of history's most famous queens, there lived a woman whose name would become a legend feared even by the greatest empire of her age. Her name was Tomyris. A queen. A mother. A ruler of the Massagetae, and according to one of the most famous stories of the ancient world, the woman who defeated Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. For many, Cyrus was nearly unstoppable. He was the conqueror of mighty kingdoms. He broke the Medes. He defeated Lydia. He took Babylon. He built one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. And yet, at the edge of that empire, on the wild frontier where the steppe met ambition, he found something he could not conquer. A people who would not kneel, and a queen who would not forgive. But to understand Tomyris, we must first understand the world she came from, because she did not rise from a palace of polished stone. She did not rule over walled cities, bureaucratic temples, or scribes who recorded every decree in clay. She came from a different kind of civilization. The Massagetae were not an empire in the way the Persians were an empire. They were not urban. They were not defined by great capitals or monumental architecture. They were a people of movement, of camps, of horses, of seasonal migration, of hard skies and open land. The settled empires, they often seemed wild. Themselves, they were free. Their lives were tied to the rhythms of nature. They moved with their herds. They understood terrain in a way no palace general ever could. They were raised to ride, to hunt, to endure, and to fight. In the ancient world, such peoples were often described by their enemies as barbarians. But history teaches us something again and again. Those who live beyond the walls are not always weak. Sometimes, they are the ones the walls fear most. The Massagetae belonged to the great tradition of steppe peoples who could appear suddenly, strike hard, disappear into distance, and survive where organized armies struggled. Their world demanded resilience. Children grew up fast. Men and women alike understood hardship, and war was not a distant event carried out by professional soldiers far away. War was part of survival. In such a society, leadership was not just about birth. It was about strength, wisdom, and the ability to command loyalty. And this is what makes Tomyris so extraordinary, because in a world that outsiders often imagined as brutal and male-dominated, she emerged not as a symbolic queen, not as a ceremonial widow, but as a true ruler. A woman whose authority was real. Ancient sources do not tell us everything about her early life. They do not leave behind intimate details, letters, or personal reflections. We do not hear her voice directly. As with so many figures from the distant past, what survives is fragmentary, but what survives is powerful. Tomyris appears in history as the ruler of the Massagetae after the death of her husband. And this alone matters, because it tells us that when the moment came, she was not cast aside. She was not hidden. She was not replaced by some distant male relative to satisfy the expectations of foreign chroniclers. She ruled. That means her people accepted her authority. That means her position was not merely decorative. That means when danger approached, it was her judgment that mattered, and danger was coming. Because to the south and west, a power unlike any before it was expanding across the ancient world. The Persians. Under Cyrus the Great, Persia was becoming more than a kingdom. It was becoming an empire of astonishing speed and scale. Cyrus was not merely a warrior. He was a strategist. A diplomat. A king who understood both conquest and image. He could defeat an enemy and then present himself as a liberator. He could crush resistance and then absorb whole cultures into his rule. This made him more dangerous than a simple invader. He did not only destroy. He incorporated. And one by one, the great powers of his world fell before him. To many observers, it may have seemed that nothing could stop him. But empire has a habit of mistaking momentum for destiny, and the further an empire expands, the more likely it is to believe that every frontier will yield as easily as the last. The lands of the Massagetae were not like Babylon. They were not like Lydia. They were not like the rich river civilizations that could be subdued by seizing capitals, taking granaries, or controlling roads. The steppe was different. There was no easy heart to strike. No single city to occupy and declare victory. No palace to seize and call the war complete. To conquer a people of the steppe, you had to do more than win a battle. You had to break their will, and that was far harder. Tomyris understood this instinctively because it was the world she had always known. For her, survival was not built on walls. It was built on mobility, memory, and pride. She was not defending a monument. She was defending a way of life. And when a people believe that defeat means not just losing land but losing themselves, they become far more dangerous than any imperial map can predict. Somewhere in those years, as Persia's shadow lengthened, the collision became inevitable. Cyrus would hear of the lands beyond his reach. He would hear of the queen. He would hear of the people who had not yet bowed, and in time, he would decide that they, too, must become part of his empire. But before swords were drawn, before blood stained the earth, there would first come something more subtle. A message. An offer. Or perhaps a trap disguised as diplomacy. And in that moment, the fate of a queen, a son, a king, and an empire would begin to turn. In the next part, we will enter the dangerous game between Tomyris and Cyrus the Great, and see how a proposal that may have looked like peace became the first step toward one of the most unforgettable clashes of the ancient world. By the time Cyrus the Great turned his attention toward the lands of the Massagetae, he was already a living legend. His name had spread across the ancient world like thunder before a storm. Kings feared him. Cities opened their gates to him. Peoples who once thought themselves secure discovered that the Persian king could arrive faster, strike harder, and endure longer than they imagined. He was no reckless brute. That is what made him so dangerous. Cyrus understood that not every victory had to begin with a battle. Sometimes the strongest blow came before the army even marched. And so, when he looked toward the lands ruled by Tomyris, he did not begin with immediate war. According to the most famous ancient account, he began with diplomacy. Or rather, something that wore the face of diplomacy. Cyrus is said to have sent a proposal to Tomyris. A marriage. At first glance, it might sound almost noble. A union between rulers. A peaceful alliance. A way to bind peoples together without bloodshed. But ancient politics was rarely so innocent. This was not a romantic gesture. It was not the language of affection. It was the language of power. A marriage to Tomyris would not simply mean a shared throne. It could mean legitimacy, influence, control. The gradual absorption of her people into Persian power without needing to openly conquer them. It was a beautiful mask for a political move, and Tomyris saw through it. This matters deeply, because in that moment she recognized exactly what she was facing. Not merely a king, not merely an army, but an empire that could use words as effectively as weapons. She refused him, and with that refusal, the path toward war became clearer. To reject Cyrus was not a small act. It was not simply a personal insult. It was a refusal to submit to the gravitational pull of the most powerful ruler in the region. Tomyris was not deceived by grandeur. She understood that accepting such an offer could mean the end of her people's independence. And so she chose danger over surrender. This was the first great act that defines her in history. Not the battle, not the revenge, not the blood, the refusal. The moment she said no to empire. But for Cyrus, refusal was not always the end of negotiation. Sometimes it was simply the moment when negotiation transformed into strategy. If Tomyris would not come willingly, then Persia would come to her. Still, even then, the coming conflict was not simple. The lands of the Massagetae lay beyond major rivers and difficult terrain. Campaigning there would be harder than many previous conquests. The farther an army travels from its familiar centers of supply, the more vulnerable it becomes. Cyrus knew this. That is why the conflict that followed was not only about force. It was about deception. Before the decisive battle, there was an encounter that would change everything. According to the traditional account, Tomyris had a son, often named Spargopizes. He was not merely her child. He represented succession, continuity, the future of her line, and perhaps a military role within her people's resistance. And he would become central to the tragedy. The Persians, it is said, used a tactic unfamiliar or at least unusually effective against the Massagetae. They left behind a camp filled with food and wine. This may sound insignificant to modern ears, but in ancient storytelling, it is crucial. The steppe warriors attacked, overcame part of the Persian force, and then entered the camp. There they found luxury, rich provisions, abundant supplies, and especially wine. This is often emphasized because some ancient accounts portray the Massagetae as less accustomed to wine than settled peoples like the Persians. Whether that detail is perfectly accurate or exaggerated by Greek storytelling, the symbolic meaning is clear. What could not be won immediately by direct force might be won through temptation. The warriors feasted. They drank. Their discipline weakened, and then the Persians returned. What followed was not a fair battle. It was a slaughter. Many of Tomyris' people were killed. Others were captured, and among those taken was her son. This moment changes everything. Up until now, the conflict had been about politics, territory, power, and resistance. Now it became personal. The story tells us that Spargopizes, once he realized what had happened and understood his humiliation, begged to be released from his bonds. When he was freed, he took his own life. Whether every detail is literally true, we cannot know. But the emotional force of the story is unmistakable. Tomyris had not simply been challenged by an empire. She had been deceived. Her people had been struck through trickery. And her son was gone. In the ancient world, this was not just grief. It was dishonor, blood debt, and a call for vengeance. Tomyris then sent Cyrus a message, and this message is one of the most powerful in all of ancient legend. She is said to have told him that although he had won through deceit, he had not truly defeated her. She warned him to leave. To be satisfied. To withdraw while he still could. And if he did not, she swore that she would give him all the blood he desired. It is one of those moments in history that feels almost theatrical in its perfection. A queen of the steppe, grieving and furious, speaking to the greatest conqueror of her age not as a supplicant, but as an equal in wrath. She did not plead. She did not beg for peace. She did not collapse beneath loss. She answered sorrow with a vow, and here we begin to understand why Tomyris endured in memory. Because she becomes, in this moment, larger than a ruler. She becomes an embodiment of resistance sharpened by grief. For Cyrus, this should have been a warning. A frontier ruler who still has the will to fight after suffering loss is often more dangerous, not less. But empires often make the same mistake. They believe that a clever victory proves superiority. They assume that if the enemy has been humiliated once, the end is near. Yet humiliation can create something far deadlier than fear. It can create absolute resolve. Somewhere beyond the river, beyond the smoke of that trap, Tomyris was preparing not for negotiation, but for annihilation. The next clash would not be a raid. It would not be a clever maneuver. It would not be a half-victory dressed in strategy. It would be the battle that would decide whether the Persian king would add another nation to his empire, or whether his ambition would finally meet its limit. In the next part, we ride into that confrontation, where the grief of a queen and the pride of an empire would collide in one of the most legendary battles of the ancient world. There are battles in history that change borders, and then there are battles that become something more. Battles that become warnings. Battles that become symbols. Battles that survive not only in records, but in memory. The clash between Tomyris and Cyrus the Great belongs to that second kind. By the time the final confrontation came, this was no longer a campaign of expansion. This was no longer simply Persia versus a frontier people. This had become a struggle charged with fury, humiliation, grief, and pride. On one side stood Cyrus, founder of an empire that had devoured kingdoms. On the other stood Tomyris, ruler of the Massagetae, a queen who had lost her son and who had sworn that the Persian king would pay. Ancient sources describe the coming battle as fierce beyond comparison. Whether every detail can be trusted exactly as told is less important than what the tradition consistently insists upon. This was not a minor skirmish. It was a brutal, decisive, and devastating clash. To understand why, we must imagine the battlefield not as a neat map but as a living environment. The steppe is deceptive. To outsiders, it can seem empty. But emptiness is an illusion. For those who know it, the land is full of pathways, distances, rhythms, and opportunities. The Massagetae were not fighting in foreign territory. They were fighting in a world that shaped them. Their mobility mattered. Their endurance mattered. Their knowledge of terrain mattered. Their style of warfare mattered. The Persians, for all their discipline and strength, were still operating at the edge of imperial reach, and that edge is where even great armies become vulnerable. Some accounts suggest that the battle was enormous and extraordinarily bloody. That makes sense. Tomyris would not have sought a symbolic gesture. She would have sought total redress. If her son had been taken through deceit, then the answer had to be unmistakable. If Persia wanted submission, then the steppe would answer with destruction. We should be careful, of course. Ancient historians often magnified numbers and dramatized violence. But even allowing for exaggeration, the story survives because something extraordinary happened. Cyrus did not win. And more than that, he died. Pause for a moment and consider what that meant. This was not the death of an obscure general, not the loss of a provincial commander, not a temporary setback. This was the death of Cyrus the Great, the man who had conquered the Medes, the man who had overthrown Croesus of Lydia, the man who had taken Babylon, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. A ruler whose name would echo through history as one of the great architects of ancient power. And yet here, at the edge of the steppe, he met his end. For later generations, that fact alone was astonishing. How could such a man die at the hands of a people so often dismissed by urban empires? How could a king of such brilliance be destroyed so far from the monumental centers of civilization? The answer is as old as empire itself. Because conquest is not the same as invincibility. Because momentum is not the same as wisdom. Because the further power reaches, the more likely it is to forget that not every land can be mastered by the same method. And because grief can turn a ruler into something terrifying. Tomyris did not fight as a queen defending prestige. She fought as a sovereign defending her people and avenging her son. That matters. Because wars of ambition and wars of vengeance are not the same point. One seeks gain. The other seeks balance through blood. The ancient tradition does not give us a clean tactical diagram. It does not preserve a detailed military report. But it gives us something else. It gives us emotional truth. It tells us that the battle was savage, that the fighting was intense, that the losses were severe, and that in the end, the Persians were broken. This is exactly the kind of battle steppe warfare could produce against an overextended invading force. An army drawn deeper into hostile territory. A people fighting with total commitment. A ruler who underestimated both the land and the enemy. And somewhere amid the dust, cries, arrows, and collapsing lines, Cyrus fell. Perhaps he died in direct combat. Perhaps amid confusion. Perhaps in the chaos that ancient storytellers later transformed into legend. The exact final moment is hidden from us. But the result is not that he was dead. The conqueror had been conquered. The empire builder had reached a frontier he could not cross. And in that moment, Tomyris passed from history into immortality. Because once Cyrus died, the story could no longer remain local. It became a tale that the wider ancient world would repeat again and again. A woman from the steppe had defeated the greatest king of her age. That alone was enough to ensure remembrance. But the story was not finished. Because what came after the battle is the part that made Tomyris unforgettable even to those who never cared about the Massagetae, never studied the steppe, and never understood the politics of that frontier. It is the moment when history and legend become inseparable. The moment when victory becomes a scene so vivid, so symbolic, and so brutal that it could survive for more than 2,000 years. In the next part, we come to the most famous and chilling image in the entire story of Tomyris, the fate of Cyrus after death, and the legend that transformed a queen's vengeance into one of the most unforgettable scenes of the ancient world. After the battle, there was silence. Not peace, not relief, silence. The kind of silence that comes only after devastation. The cries of the wounded begin to fade. The dust slowly settles. The horses breathe heavily in the open air. Weapons lie scattered in the dirt. Bodies cover the field. And somewhere among the dead lay the man who had once seemed larger than history itself, Cyrus the Great, the founder of an empire, the conqueror of kings, the ruler who had bent mighty lands to his will, now motionless, now powerless, now just another body on a battlefield far from the centers of his glory. This is where the story of Tomyris becomes one of the most powerful legends of antiquity. According to the best-known ancient tradition, Tomyris found the body of Cyrus after the battle, and what happened next would ensure that her name would never disappear. The story says she ordered his head cut off. Then she had a vessel brought before her, or in some versions a skin or container filled with human blood, and then, looking upon the dead conqueror, she is said to have spoken words that have echoed through history. "You who were never satisfied with blood, now drink your fill." And with that, according to legend, she plunged his severed head into the blood. Whether every detail happened exactly this way, we cannot know. And that is important to say clearly. Ancient history is not a courtroom transcript. It is not a modern documentary archive. It is a world of memory, retelling, political interpretation, and symbolic storytelling. Great events were often shaped into dramatic forms that captured their meaning even if they transformed the literal details. But even if this exact scene was embellished, or stylized, or partly legendary, its survival tells us something profound. It tells us how the ancient world remembered Tomyris, not as a defeated widow, not as a tragic victim, not as a minor frontier ruler who briefly inconvenienced Persia, but as a queen whose vengeance was so complete that even the corpse of the greatest conqueror of her age became part of her message. That message was simple. Blood answered with blood. The symbolism is extraordinary. Cyrus had come seeking expansion, power, and submission. He had used deception. He had struck her people through cunning. He had taken her son. And now, in the story told for generations, Tomyris answered not with diplomacy, not with compromise, but with ritualized justice. In the imagination of later ages, she became something almost mythic. A ruler, a mother, a judge, a destroyer of arrogance. The scene also reveals something essential about ancient ideas of kingship and punishment. To defeat a king in battle was one thing. To humiliate him after death was something else entirely. It was a statement not only of military victory, but of moral triumph. Tomyris was not merely saying, "I won." She was saying, "You deserve this." That distinction matters, because in ancient storytelling, kings often stood as symbols of cosmic order, divine favor, or destiny. To reduce such a king to a severed head in blood was to reverse the entire image of imperial power. It was to strip away grandeur and expose mortality. And this is why the legend endured. Because people remember reversals. They remember the mighty brought low. They remember pride shattered. They remember the moment when a ruler who seemed invincible is revealed to be flesh. But beyond the shock of the image, there is also the emotional truth beneath it. Tomyris, in the traditional story, is not motivated by cruelty alone. She is driven by loss. Her son is gone. Her people have bled. Her trust was answered with deceit. The blood of Cyrus is not presented as random brutality. It is presented as repayment. And that is precisely why the story resonated so deeply across generations. It contains all the elements ancient audiences never forgot. A mighty king. A deceptive act. A dead son. A grieving mother. A final battle. A fallen conqueror. And vengeance made visible. This is not just history. It is almost tragedy. Yet it would be a mistake to reduce Tomyris only to revenge. Because if we do that, we miss something larger. Her story is not simply about what she did to Cyrus. It is about what she represented. She represented a frontier the empire could not absorb. She represented a people who would not disappear into Persian administration. She represented a world beyond the city, beyond the palace, beyond the imperial map. And she represented a kind of power the ancient world often struggled to categorize. A woman who was not merely symbolic, but sovereign. That alone makes her remarkable. Even today, when we think of powerful women in antiquity, the same names tend to return again and again: Cleopatra, Nefertiti, perhaps Boudica. But Tomyris belongs in that company, and in some ways she is even more startling. Because unlike queens who ruled within established palace cultures, Tomyris emerges from a world often described by outsiders as wild, marginal, or uncivilized. Yet in that world, she becomes the figure who defeats the founder of one of history's greatest empires. This is why her story survived, not only because it was dramatic, but because it overturned expectations. The empire did not triumph. The king did not prevail. The frontier did not yield. And the woman did not break. She became legend. But what happened after such a victory? Did Tomyris go on to rule for many years? Did her people transform their triumph into lasting political dominance? Did Persia collapse? The answers are more complicated. Because victory in a single battle, even a legendary one, does not always rewrite the whole world. And yet, even when empires survive, some defeats leave scars that history never forgets. In the next part, we will Explore what came after the death of Cyrus, what this victory meant for Tomyris and the Massagetae, and why her name outlived so many rulers who once seemed far more powerful. When the dust settled and the blood darkened the earth, something remained on that battlefield beyond the bodies of the fallen. A message that spread faster than any rider, faster than royal orders, faster than rumor, faster than fear itself. Cyrus the Great was dead. That fact alone was enough to shake the imagination of the ancient world. This was no ordinary ruler. He had defeated the Medes. He had broken the power of Lydia. He had taken Babylon. He had forged the foundations of one of the greatest empires of antiquity. Many later generations would remember him as a brilliant conqueror, a capable ruler, even a king of unusual vision. And yet, in the story of Tomyris, he is remembered differently. He is remembered as the man who underestimated the steppe. And more importantly, the man who underestimated a queen whose people could neither be bought nor frightened into obedience. That is the heart of the legend. Tomyris did not simply win a battle. She shattered the illusion that imperial expansion was inevitable. For empires, this is a dangerous kind of defeat, not because it always destroys them immediately, but because it exposes their limits. And it is important to say this clearly. The death of Cyrus did not mean the immediate collapse of the Persian Empire. Persia was already too vast, too organized, and too strong to vanish with the death of one man, even a founder. His successors would continue to rule. Cambyses would come after him. Later, Darius would strengthen and expand Persian power even further. The empire survived. But survival is not the same as invulnerability. Tomyris had shown the world something that could not be unseen. Even the greatest king could fall. Even the most powerful empire could fail. Even the people dismissed as barbarians could become the authors of history's most devastating reversal. And perhaps this is why Tomyris remained so compelling to later generations. She stood at the intersection of everything people remember best: power and pride, deception and grief, motherhood and vengeance, frontier and empire. A conqueror rising and then falling. Her story contains the emotional architecture of myth. That does not mean it is false. It means it became larger than mere record. Ancient history often survives not only because something happened, but because what happened felt meaningful enough to retell. Tomyris became exactly that kind of figure. For many later readers, she was not just the queen of the Massagetae. She became a symbol of resistance against overwhelming power. A symbol of justice answered in ancient terms. A symbol of the dangerous arrogance of kings. And a symbol that unsettled old assumptions about women in the ancient world. Because Tomyris did not fit the easy patterns, she was not remembered as a passive royal woman hidden in a palace. She was not reduced to an ornamental role beside a male ruler. She was not merely a wife whose story ended in widowhood. She was a sovereign. She made political decisions. She rejected Cyrus. She faced invasion. She suffered personal loss. She answered with war. And she emerged as the destroyer of a king. That is not a small role in history. That is monumental. And yet, there is another reason her story matters. It forces us to look again at the Massagetae themselves. Without them, Tomyris is only a name attached to a dramatic event. With them, she becomes part of a much larger historical truth. The truth that nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples have often been underestimated by the settled civilizations that wrote most of the surviving records. The Persians had palaces. The Babylonians had archives. The Egyptians had temples and inscriptions. The peoples of the steppe often left behind fewer monumental traces. And because of that, later ages sometimes mistook lesser visibility for lesser importance. But the steppe was never empty. It was never meaningless. It was full of cultures, systems of power, traditions of warfare, forms of leadership, and social orders that did not need marble to be real. The Massagetae may not have left behind vast libraries, but they left behind an event so powerful that it entered the historical imagination of civilizations far beyond their own world. That is no small legacy, and it tells us something else. Civilization is not measured only by stone. A people do not need massive walls to possess law, honor, memory, or identity. A nation without monuments can still be formidable. A people without archives can still change history. And a queen without a palace can still become immortal. This is part of why Tomyris feels so modern in some strange way. She reminds us that history is not always made by those who build the biggest capitals. Sometimes it is made by those who refuse to kneel. Still, we must be honest. Victory came at a cost. The story of Tomyris is not a clean triumph. It is soaked in loss. If the ancient tradition is correct, she lost her son. Her people died in battle. The steppe itself became a graveyard. Every ancient victory carried that burden. Behind every legend of glory are bodies. Behind every famous reversal are the mothers who lost sons, the children who lost fathers, the warriors who never returned to camp. That is what gives her story its weight. It is not a fantasy of victory without pain. It is a story of freedom purchased at terrible cost. And that may be why it still resonates. Because it is not simply about revenge. It is about the price of refusing domination. In the final part, we will step beyond the battlefield and ask the deeper question: who was Tomyris in the memory of later ages? How did she survive in art, legend, and historical imagination? And what does her story still say to us more than 2,500 years later? When the battle ended, another struggle began. Not a struggle of swords, not a struggle of cavalry, not a struggle between armies. A struggle over memory. Because some people die, and their names vanish with them. Others leave behind temples, inscriptions, statues, and stone. And then there are those who leave behind something even more powerful. A story that refuses to die. That is what Tomyris became. A story. But not just any story. A story that survived empires. A story that crossed centuries. A story that entered the imagination of people who would never see the steppe, never meet the Massagetae, and never hear the sound of war beneath that vast open sky. So who is Tomyris in the eyes of history? The answer depends on who is looking. Some. She was a frontier queen. A ruler of the Massagetae. A woman of the steppe. A mother who avenged her son. An enemy of Persia. Others. She became something larger. A warning. A challenge to imperial pride. A symbol of resistance. A reminder that history does not belong only to great capitals and palace dynasties. And that matters, because for a very long time, much of ancient history was preserved through the eyes of literate empires. Those who had scribes, archives, official inscriptions, and monumental states often controlled how the past was remembered. That means many nomadic peoples survive in the record only through the words of outsiders. And outsiders often misunderstand what they fear. The Massagetae were frequently described as wild or uncivilized. But such labels reveal more about the anxieties of empires than the reality of the steppe. Because what urban states often called barbarism was sometimes simply independence. What they called chaos was often a different kind of order. What they called savagery was often a refusal to submit. Tomyris and her people force us to confront that bias. They remind us that history is not only the story of those who built cities. It is also the story of those who moved beyond them. The Massagetae did not rule from marble halls. They did not fill archives with royal decrees. They did not leave behind towering monuments designed to outlast centuries. Their world was made of movement. Of horses crossing distance. Of camps that could rise and vanish. Of memory carried in stories, songs, bloodlines, and tradition. That makes them harder to study. But not less important. In fact, it may make them more revealing. because they show us that power can exist outside the forms empire prefers. Tomyris herself became one of the most striking examples of that truth. She is not always as famous today as Cleopatra or Nefertiti. Her face is not as widely recognized. Her name is not always the first to appear in popular lists of ancient queens. And yet, in many ways, she is one of the most extraordinary women in all of antiquity, because she did something unforgettable. She stood against one of the greatest conquerors in history, and according to the tradition that survived, she defeated him. That alone places her among the most powerful female figures of the ancient world. But her legacy goes beyond the battle. Over the centuries, artists, writers, and thinkers return to her story again and again. In paintings, she appears as a stern queen, sometimes regal, sometimes grim, sometimes tragic, sometimes terrifying. In literature, she becomes many things at once. A grieving mother. A righteous avenger. A savage barbarian in the eyes of some. A heroine of liberty in the eyes of others. And that is what makes her fascinating. Tomyris became a mirror. Each age saw in her what it most feared, admired, or desired. Some saw vengeance. Some saw justice. Some saw the humiliation of empire. Some saw the power of female rule. Some saw the blood-soaked cost of pride. This is how legends endure. They remain alive because they can be read in more than one way. But we must ask the historian's question. How much of Tomyris is precise history, and how much is legend? The honest answer is simple. We will never know completely. We have ancient accounts. We have traditions. We have interpretations shaped by later retelling. But we do not have her own voice. No letters. No personal testimony. No royal inscription in her own hand. No direct version of the story from her people's perspective. And that means the Tomyris we know today is layered. She is part history, part memory, part outsider narrative, part symbolism, part myth. Yet that does not make her less important. In some ways, it makes her even more revealing. Because history is not only made of facts. It is also made of what people choose to remember. And what the ancient world chose to remember about Tomyris is profoundly meaningful. It remembered a woman who did not yield. It remembered a queen who could not be manipulated by marriage. It remembered a ruler who answered deceit with judgment. It remembered a people who refused absorption. It remembered the moment when imperial certainty met its limit. And perhaps that is why her story still feels alive today. Even now, more than 2,500 years later, Tomyris speaks to something timeless. She reminds us that size is not the same as strength, that power is not the same as wisdom, that expansion is not the same as destiny, that underestimating a people because they live differently can be fatal, and that those dismissed as peripheral often become central at the most decisive moments. She also reminds us of something deeper. That women in the ancient world were not always silent shadows behind male rulers. Sometimes they stood at the center. Sometimes they ruled. Sometimes they fought. Sometimes they made decisions that changed the fate of nations. And sometimes, despite the efforts of history to narrow them, they became impossible to erase. Tomyris is one of those women. Perhaps that is why her story remains so powerful. At its core lies an eternal question. What happens when power believes it has no limits? Cyrus believed he could take one more land, win one more victory, fold one more people into the empire. Tomyris showed him that there is always a frontier somewhere. A place where ambition meets resistance. A place where pride meets consequence. A place where history turns. And so, if we imagine her one last time, let us not see only the most violent version of the legend. Let us not see only the severed head, the blood, or the fury. Let us see the larger image. A queen standing at the edge of the steppe, the wind moving across the open land, the silence after battle, her people behind her. A people who did not survive in stone, but in Memory. A people whose story was not carved into monumental walls, but carried forward because they stopped an empire. And there, at the horizon between the known world and the wild lands beyond it, stands Tomyris, queen, mother, war leader, ruler of the steppe, and the woman history could not subdue. And so ends the story of Tomyris. A woman who stood against one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world. A queen whose people proved that freedom could be worth more than empire. A name that still survives because it carries something timeless within it: resistance, loss, pride, justice, and the terrible price of power. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Relics of Time, and tell me in the comments what surprised you most about Tomyris and the Massagetae. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Your support means more than you know. And remember, history is not only the past. It is made of relics of time that still speak.